What if I told you that some of the most powerful people in the world were connected to a man accused of trafficking minors? Private jets, royal palaces, billionaires, presidents, and at the center of it all, Jeffrey Epstein. He had everything: money, influence, protection, until the girls started speaking, and when he was finally arrested in 2019, he died before trial, officially ruled a suicide. But the questions never died. Tonight, we're not talking about conspiracy. We're talking about survivors and the power structures they exposed. This is the story they tried to bury. It began quietly, behind velvet ropes, inside private mansions, on a secluded island surrounded by blue water and secrecy. For years, the world saw only wealth, private jets, elite universities, royal connections, political influence. But behind the polished surface, survivors describe something else: manipulation, grooming, control, and abuse. At the center of it all was financier Jeffrey Epstein. He cultivated power carefully: donations to universities, relationships with politicians, access to celebrities. He built an image of intellect and influence. But according to federal prosecutors and multiple survivors, behind closed doors, he ran a system designed to exploit vulnerable teenage girls. One of the most widely known voices to emerge was Virginia Giuffre. She says she was 16 when she was recruited. The introduction allegedly came through Ghislaine Maxwell, a British socialite who moved comfortably among elites. What was presented as an opportunity, massage work, financial help, mentorship, became something darker. Virginia later alleged she was trafficked to powerful men. Among the names publicly mentioned was Prince Andrew. For years, she says, she felt trapped. Power creates silence, and silence protects power. But eventually, she spoke. Her allegations were met with skepticism, legal threats, and public scrutiny. Still, she continued. When Epstein was arrested again in July 2019 on federal sex trafficking charges, it felt like a turning point. For the first time, the machinery of influence appeared vulnerable. Then, only weeks later, Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. Authorities ruled it a suicide. The news ignited global outrage. Questions surfaced about prison failures, security lapses, and oversight. For many survivors, his death felt like stolen justice. But the story did not end there. Another survivor, Courtney Wild, had already been fighting a different battle. She had been 14 when she says the abuse began. In 2008, Epstein secured a controversial non-prosecution agreement in Florida. The deal allowed him to plead guilty to state charges while avoiding federal prosecution. The agreement was arranged under federal prosecutors at the time, overseen by Alexander Acosta, who later resigned from his cabinet position in 2019 after renewed scrutiny. The most shocking part? The victims were not informed about the agreement. Courtney Wild challenged that secrecy in court. She argued that victims have the right to be notified and heard. In 2019, a federal judge ruled that the original agreement had violated victims' rights. It was a legal acknowledgement that the system had failed them. Even after Epstein's death, lawsuits continued. Thousands of documents were unsealed. Names surfaced. Connections were mapped. Questions deepened. Attention turned once again to Ghislaine Maxwell. Prosecutors alleged she was not just present, but instrumental. They argued she recruited minors, normalized abuse, and facilitated meetings. In July 2020, Maxwell was arrested. Her trial began in late 2021 in federal court in New York. Survivors testified in detail. They described grooming tactics, isolation, gradual boundary violations. Defense attorneys challenged credibility. Jurors deliberated. In December 2021, Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty on multiple counts related to sex trafficking of minors. In 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. For some survivors, it was the first tangible form of justice, not complete justice, but accountability. Meanwhile, a victim compensation program established after Epstein's death distributed hundreds of millions of dollars to claimants. For many survivors, the financial settlements were secondary. What mattered more was recognition, being believed, being heard. The Epstein case forced uncomfortable questions into public conversation. How does wealth influence justice? How do networks of power protect themselves? Why do victims so often go unheard for years? And what happens when they finally refuse to stay silent? The case also exposed how grooming works, not always through violence, but through psychological control. Gradual normalization, financial dependence, isolation from support systems. Survivors describe confusion at first, then fear, then shame, and silence, because powerful people rarely look like criminals. They look like benefactors, philanthropists, friends of presidents, guests at royal events. That contrast made speaking out even harder. But the voices grew. Civil lawsuits moved forward. Media investigations expanded. Public awareness increased. The narrative shifted from scandal to systemic failure, from conspiracy to documented testimony. And perhaps the most lasting impact of the case is not a single conviction. It is the reminder that influence does not equal immunity, and that accountability, even delayed, can still reshape history. The Epstein story is not only about one man. It is about structures, power structures, legal structures, social structures. It is about how easily silence can be purchased and how difficult, yet powerful, it is to break it. Today, many survivors continue advocating for stronger protections for victims of trafficking and abuse. They push for transparency, for legal reform, for institutional accountability. Their message is simple: listen earlier, investigate deeper, protect the vulnerable, because exploitation thrives in secrecy, but collapses under exposure. The story shocked the world, but for the survivors, it was never a headline. It was their life. And by speaking publicly, they transformed personal trauma into public reckoning. History will remember the wealth, the island, the names, but it should also remember the voices, the ones who refused to disappear, the ones who stood up against power and forced the world to look.